So we are really pleased to have Kathy Lett and Mary Beth Sheridan from EPA with us to talk about the Hazardous Waste Generator Improvements Rule. Kathy has worked for EPA for 17 years, primarily on hazardous waste recycling and generator issues, as well as on energy conservation and waste management. Recently, she's worked on the definition of solid waste rulemaking and the Hazardous Waste Generator Improvements Rule. She has a Bachelor of Arts from Hamilton College in Clinton, New York. And then, as you can see on the agenda, unless you're just calling in, Mary Beth Sheridan is from the Office of Resource Conservation and Recovery also. She's worked at EPA since 1997, primarily on hazardous waste recycling and generation. Before coming to EPA, she worked as an environmental consultant, a technical writer at McCoy & Associates, and an information specialist for EPA's RCRA Superfund hotline. She graduated from St. Lawrence University with a double major in environmental studies and biology and has a master's degree in environmental policy and management from the University of Denver. So these two ladies are going to both give us the presentation, and I will turn it over to them.
Okay, hi. This is Kathy. I'm going to start things off for us. Okay, great. Okay, there we go. Okay, sorry about that.
No problem.
We have a lot to cover, so now we're going to go extra fast. But this is the general outline of what we're going to be talking about today. We do have a brief background. We recognize that not everybody on the line today is doing RIFRA as their primary focus, so we are going to try and put a little context around this. But we are going to try and run through all our provisions and then get on to question and answer time. RCRA, as you guys probably know, is the waste statute with the main goals of protecting human health and the environment, conserving energy and natural resources, and reducing waste. RCRA has several different parts. The part that we're talking about in this rulemaking was hazardous waste specifically, and then within hazardous waste, we're talking the requirements for the generators of hazardous waste as compared to or opposed to definition of solid waste or hazardous waste questions, or what the facilities have to do. I do also want to point out that nothing about this rule changed the household hazardous waste exemption that you may be familiar with. We didn't touch that as part of the rule. Within the hazardous waste generation requirements, there are different levels of regulation for the generators depending on how much they generate. It's a graduated requirements with very small quantity generators, which are what we used to call conditionally exempt small quantity generators, or C-squeegees. As part of this rule, we changed that name to very small quantity generators, having the fewest requirements, and then small quantity generators having some more, and large quantity generators having the most requirements. These are the general areas for how much per month a generator generates to be in each category. So very small quantity generators have less than 100 kilograms per month. Small quantity generators have between 100 and 1,000 kilograms per month, and large quantity generators have more than 1,000 kilograms. And those, as I mentioned, those generation categories are based on per month, per calendar month generation of hazardous waste.
Okay, so now I'm just going to go quickly over how we got to where we are today. So those of you who are familiar with RCRA know that the program started back in the 1980s, and it's considered a kind of a cradle to grave program. So the generators are the beginning, and then the waste is tracked and managed, hopefully properly, all the way to the disposal, which is the grave. So the rules were originally promulgated in the early 1980s, and so most of the generator program is over 30 years old. And we did a number of program evaluations And we also did an advance notice of proposed rulemaking and held public meetings to try to find out where we could improve the generator program. After those, which were between 2004 and 2014, we did do some non-regulatory actions, but we got to a point where we realized most of the remaining issues had to be fixed through a rulemaking. So we did a proposal in September 2015, and this final rule came out of that proposal. So we received over 230 public comments across a wide range of participants commented, half of the states, some local governments, a lot of academic institutions, colleges and universities. There were comments from the energy sector and utilities and industry and the related trade associations, and then also specifically from the waste management industry. And the comments ranged the gamut. There were a lot on waste determination, marking and labeling, and some of the new provisions, which we're going to talk about, which are VSQG consolidation and episodic generation. The final rule was signed October 28th, 2016, and published a month later. And the effective date was May 30th, 2017. And this is the federal effective date. RCRA is a state authorized program, so most states run the program in their states, and they have to go through a process to adopt and get authorized for the rule. So right now, it's effective in Iowa, Alaska, and the territories and tribal lands because the federal government runs the program in those states. And then the authorized states go through this process and pick up their own regulations to at least match the federal. And they have to do that by July 1st, 2018, unless they need to do state legislative change, and then they get an extra year. So they have to pick up the more stringent provisions. They can choose whether to pick up the less stringent provisions, which I'm going to show you in a second, and those that we consider equally stringent. So this is a map where the rule is in effect right now. There's about 4 states that have gone through the process of adopting the rule. Actually 5, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Kentucky, Georgia, and Utah. So the program is now in effect in those states, and then the ones where EPA runs the program, so Iowa and Alaska and the territories. So this slide shows you the more stringent provisions. These are the ones the states will eventually have to adopt to be, because they have to be at least as stringent as the federal program. So for small quantity generators, they're going to have to do re-notification. For SAAs, there's some specific provisions that we added that are more stringent. Those are satellite accumulation areas. And those are where waste is first generated and can be temporarily stored. The new marking and labeling requirement is more stringent. And then several notification and reporting requirements are more stringent. So the states will have to pick these up. The less stringent provisions, again, it's up to the state whether they want to. We, of course, are encouraging. We think the whole rule kind of hangs together, makes a lot of sense to do all of the provisions, but it is up to the states. And those ones we're going to go over quickly, but it's 2 new provisions, VSQG consolidation and episodic generation, and then a waiver from what's known as the 50-foot width rule. Those are less stringent.
This slide gives you an idea of the size of the generator universe. We have a very wide range as far as VSQGs. They don't have a requirement for notification or re-notification, so it's just kind of an estimation that we have. Some of the states do have a notification requirement for those guys. So we have some hard numbers, but federally it's not a requirement. SQGs have a requirement to had a requirement to notify once, and then LQGs are a pretty hard number here because of the biennial report, which is a regular renotification for them. But this will give you an idea of who is affected federally, how many entities, by the changes to the generator rules. Now, the main goals that we had going into this program change were to reorganize the regulations to make them more user-friendly, to provide greater flexibility for hazardous waste generators to manage waste in a cost-effective manner, to strengthen environmental protection in some places, and to make some clarifications where the generator program as a whole had been ambiguous, or maybe there were some conflicts in the guidance that we had put out in the past, and to clarify those points as part of this rulemaking. And each of the over 60 changes that are part of this rule tie to at least one of those goals. The first thing that we're going to talk about here is the reorganization. I don't know how familiar you guys are or have been with the generator regs at the federal level, but this is kind of a big change as far as what the regs look like. And what we did was we decided that the way that a lot of these requirements for small and large quantity generators were shoehorned into one paragraph of the regs was both confusing and not very efficient to use, because it involved a lot of cross-references to other parts of the regulations. So what we decided to do was we decided to give a paragraph of the regs to each category of generator. So as you'll see on the slide, in addition to moving some of the requirements for how to make a hazardous waste determination, we also gave 262.14 to very small quantity generators, 262.15 to satellite accumulation areas, 262.16 to small quantity generators, and 262.17 to large quantity generators. So almost all of those requirements came out of either 261.5 in the old regs or 262.34. We do have a crosswalk of this reorganization and a couple of different guidance documents that we've either completed or we're working on as far as the reorganization. So if you have questions about that, we're happy to answer it and distribute those materials. I don't know how detailed you guys are getting.
Okay, now we're getting into kind of the meat of the changes. So the first thing we did was when you first get into RCRA, you have to, the first step you take as a generator is to determine if you have a hazardous waste or not. So this section is an existing section, but what we did was we added a lot of more explanation and meat to this section, because we had found through those program evaluations that I mentioned earlier that this was an area where there was a kind of a fairly significant amount of non-compliance, ranging anywhere from the estimates from 10 to 30%. And the problem is, if you get this wrong, then you're managing waste improperly the whole way through the chain. So we did propose also require people to document if they had non-hazardous waste, but we ended up not finalizing that because we got a lot of negative comments on that. We are continuing to recommend it as a best practice. So what we did do for this section was we clarified that you do have to make the hazardous waste determination. It has to be accurate. It has to be made at the point of generation, and you have to make sure that that determination carries through. So if the waste has the potential to change its properties enough that it could cause it to turn from hazardous waste or non-hazardous waste into hazardous waste, you need to do another hazardous waste determination. So the regulations at this section have a lot more information now on how they can use generator knowledge and what tests they need to use to make hazardous waste determinations, and also determine if it's characteristic, which is part of the determination. And then the last thing we did in this section was we moved the record keeping for your waste determinations into this section. So it's clear that once you make the determinations, you have to document that and keep those records. Again, this is for the hazardous waste determination.
Okay, so after a generator makes the waste determination, the generator then has to count their hazardous waste in order to determine if they're a very small quantity generator, a small quantity generator, or a large quantity generator. So 262.13 is a new section in the regulations, and it's really focused on counting. It does draw from an old set of rules that was in 261.5. That section is totally gone now, and it's moved into the other parts of the regs, including here in 262.13. So what this section does is it clarifies some existing conflicting guidance by stating that each generator can only have one generator category in a month, which is a change from some conflicting guidance that we had in the past. And it also discusses processes for how to count your hazardous waste to determine what generator category you are. And it also talks about mixing and how to count your hazardous waste when it's being mixed. Another thing that we've added as part of 262.13 is this chart. And along with some new definitions in 260.10 for the different generator categories, this really lays out in a very clear fashion how much hazardous waste generator can have per month and what category they are. As you can see, there are, we talk about counting your hazardous waste, but really there are three categories of hazardous waste that have to be counted. And these are all described in the regulations, but they're acute hazardous waste, non-acute hazardous waste, and if you have a spill of acute hazardous waste, then when you have residues from the cleanup of that, that also has to be counted, and it has different thresholds. So this new chart, or this new table in the regs, describes exactly which of these 5 situations any amount of hazardous waste would put the generator in. We made very few changes in the rules to the requirements for the very small quantity generators, and mostly the changes that we did make were to provide new options for flexibility for those generators. I'm going to talk about episodic generation. So the episodic generation provision, it affects both the very small quantity generators and the small quantity generators. And the problem that we were addressing with these changes with the traditional RIFRA regulations was that occasionally these smaller generators have some kind of an event, and we call that an episodic event, in which they generate more than the limit for their category in a month. So it could be something like a tank clean out, or a upset conditions, or a spill. So you could have either planned or unplanned events that, a generator is cruising along at 50 kilograms per month of hazardous waste, their VSQG, but then they have to clean out a tank, or there's a spill, or a storm comes through or something, and all of a sudden they're being bumped up to a category that has more stringent requirements. And without the episodic generation provisions, those generators would have to comply with that more comprehensive set of regulations for a very short period of time while they dealt with the episodic event, and then they would go back to their regular category. So we heard lots of times that this is a real challenge posed by the RIFRA regulations, and these new provisions are our attempt to address it. So basically what it comes down to, what we finalized, were that a set of provisions that allow the generators to maintain that normal existing category. So if they're normally a VSQG, they get to stay a VSQG as their category. If they're normally a small quantity generator, they get to stay as a small quantity generator under limited conditions. And they also have a streamlined set of requirements that they still have to follow. But as a rule, it does give them a much clearer path forward. So a generator can have one event per calendar year that bumps them into a higher category, and they can petition for a second event. We don't really have time to get into how all this works, but it is laid out in the rule, and we are available for questions. They have to have some requirements like notifying the state or EPA at least 30 days prior to initiating a planned event. They have to do that notification within 72 hours if they have an unplanned event. And then they have to finish their episodic event within 60 days. So they have to get all the waste off-site, generate all the waste and get it all off-site within 60 days. As far as what the management standards are under episodic generation, like I said, that they are streamlined. So for VSQGs, they have to obtain an ID number. They have to use a hazardous waste manifest and a transporter to send the episodic waste to a RIFRA designated facility. This is kind of the key one where even though they don't, a very small quantity generator doesn't have to become a small quantity generator or large quantity generator, they do have to manage the waste in the same way as they would as far as getting it off-site. So what that means is using the manifest, so it's in the cradle-to-grave system for RIFRA that Mary Beth talked about, and then sending it to a RIFRA-designated facility. So that would be a treatment, storage, or disposal facility, or to a recycler. They have to manage the episodic waste while it's on site in a manner that minimizes the possibility of accident or release. There's a labeling requirement, identification of a emergency coordinator, and then a records requirement. For small quantity generators, they basically just comply with their existing small quantity generator regulations and maintain records associated with the event. I am going to turn it over to Mary Beth to talk about the other area of flexibility that we put in the rule.
So this is also a brand new provision. It's specifically for VSQGs and allowing them to consolidate their waste at an LQG that's owned by the same person. And this is, the idea behind this is that this way there should be some time savings and cost savings on the part of the facility, but also you will end up having the waste managed in the RIFRA system. So we prefer that as the more environmentally sound option as well. And before this change, an LQG could only do this if they had a RIFRA permit. So this way they can consolidate their own waste and reduce their liability without having to get a RIFRA permit. So the provision is in the new regulations, and it's, as I said, it's basically you have to be the same company. We're saying you have to consolidate the waste at an LQG that's under the control of the same person. And the VSQG, all they have to do is mark and label their containers with the words hazardous waste and the hazards, which I'll discuss in a minute. But then the LQG, they have a few more requirements. They have to notify using the site ID form, which is the same form for all the notification under RCRA. And on that, there's an addendum where they're going to list their VSQGs that are participating. Then they have to keep records, but these can be normal business records for each shipment. Once it gets to the LQG, that waste has to be managed as the LQG manages its own hazardous waste, including getting it off-site to a RCRA designated facility. And then the last thing the LQG will do is report that waste in the biennial report. So I mentioned marking and labeling. This applies across the program, the changes. You always, at SQGs and LQGs, you always had to label your hazardous waste with the words hazardous waste, but we didn't have any other requirements, and we found that there was a problem mostly on the communicating risk in emergencies and situations like that. So we decided that we wanted there to be a little more information for people that might come in contact with the material and not know what it was. So, you know, such as emergency responders, visitors, etc. So across, starting at the satellite accumulation area, going through the generator facility, then to transfer facilities and TSDFs, if they have generator tanks and containers, you now have to include the hazard of the contents of the container. We did allow flexibility in how you label, so there's a number of different options. Most of them are already established methods, the DOT Hazard Communication System, the OSHA Hazard Statement or pictograms, NFPA Chemical Hazard Labels, that's the National Fire Prevention Association labels, or even just the RCRA words of the characteristic. So for example, ignitable or toxic, those would be enough. And if the generator has a containment building, these are pretty rare, they have to, you know, you're not going to label the building, but you have to keep the information in logs or records near the accumulation unit. And then right before it goes off-site, the generator has to either add the applicable RCRA waste codes or use a barcoding system that would tie the waste code to that particular container. So that's the new marking and labeling. I've mentioned satellite accumulation areas a couple times. We did make a number of kind of minor revisions and clarifications, but these are generally where the waste is first generated. We've had this provisions that relate to satellite accumulation areas in the regulations, but we've just kind of done some modifications to make them safer. So when you first generate the waste, you're allowed to temporarily store hazardous waste near the point of generation. So what we've added is that you still can't mix that or put it in another container if the waste is incompatible, which is a similar requirement to the longer storage areas. We are allowing containers to remain open temporarily under limited circumstances. It basically has to be necessary for safe operations. So an example is there's sometimes in a lab the hazardous waste is so hot that if you immediately closed it, you know, extreme pressure could build up and it could explode. So we're allowing it to remain open until it cools down enough to close it. But then once it's cooled, the lid needs to be closed. We are now giving a maximum weight in addition to volume for acute hazardous waste. So once you reach the limit, you have to move the waste from the satellite area to either a central accumulation area, the 90 or 180-day area, or you have to get it off-site. So we've added, for acute, it was 1 gallon, right? And we've added the 1 kilogram to, or 1 quart, and then, which the equivalent is 1 kilogram. We've also said you have 3 days to do that if you reach the limit. So for regular hazardous waste, the limit's 55 gallons. So if you reach the limit for the satellite area, you have 3 consecutive calendar days to get the waste, again, either to the 90 or 180-day area or off-site. Then we also rescinded a memo that was specific to reactive hazardous waste, where we said you could store it in a satellite area away from the point of generation. Well, we decided that that really didn't make sense. If it was so dangerous it had to be stored away from the point of generation, it should go right to the central accumulation area. And then last, we made the marking and labeling consistent with the central accumulation areas. Okay, another kind of specific change is we are now requiring SQGs to re-notify. As Kathy mentioned in the beginning, we originally, if you were an SQG, a small quantity generator, you notified once and there was no, at least at the federal level, requirement to re-notify. So as a result, after some 30 years of doing this, the databases for SQGs are pretty out of date. And it's hard to plan and make decisions and without knowing if these facilities are still in existence. So the final rule is requiring SQGs to re-notify every 4 years unless states have more frequent re-notification requirements. We're hoping that a lot of this could be done electronically, and that's part of the reason why this does have a delayed compliance date. So the first time SQGs will have to re-notify is September of 2021. And this will give states time to update their forms and databases, etc.
We made a variety of changes in the area of emergency preparedness and planning as part of the final generator rule. And I'm going to talk about 2 of the bigger ones, and then we've provided a list of some of the other changes. But for the bigger ones, one is in the making and documenting of arrangements with the local emergency responders. So small quantity generators and large quantity generators have for a long time had a requirement to make arrangements with their local emergency responders regarding the hazardous waste that they have on site and appropriate response mechanisms. This part is not new for the rule, but there was a change in the documentation in this and in a few of the details. So as far as what changed in the details, one is that we did not include local emergency planning committees in the reg text originally because they didn't exist. And so we have added those to the reg text. In some places, those particular committees, LEPCs, are on the ground, day-to-day players in the regional emergency response landscape. In other places, they're a committee that meets once a year and doesn't really have much to do day-to-day. But we did include them for the areas that they are active on the ground on a day-to-day basis. We've included them in the regulations as a group that you may have to, or that you can make arrangements with, that a generator can make arrangements with. And the other change was to do with the documentation. So the previous regs required that a generator who was not able to document or was not able to make arrangements with their local responders had to document that. But the reverse was not required, so they didn't have to document when they were able to make the arrangements. So our change was that now generators just have to document their arrangements or document that they weren't able to make them. And that makes it easier for everyone involved to be able to tell if the arrangements have been made. So that's the first change. The second has to do with the contingency plan that the large quantity generators have to make. Again, large quantity generators have a requirement to do a contingency plan, but what we heard from the emergency responders is that sometimes these plans can get really lengthy, and it's a big 3-ring binder. It's got a lot of information in it, including how a long-term cleanup might proceed. And in the moment of the emergency, what the responders want is quick access to the most important information in that plan. So what the final rule does is it addresses this by including a quick reference guide, which I'm going to talk about the details in just a second. And we have phased this requirement in though. So what the requirements say is that when a generator updates their contingency plan, they have to send that into their local emergency responders. So what we did for a phase-in was to say that any new large quantity generators have to include this quick reference guide when they're submitting their contingency plans to the local emergency responders originally. And then for existing LQGs, when they have to update their contingency plan because there was a process change or a new product or a change in the physical plant or something, so they need to update their contingency plan anyway, then they have to add the quick reference guide. As far as what has to be in this quick reference guide, like I said, it's supposed to be those elements that are going to be most critical to someone on a truck headed towards a facility to respond to an emergency. And that's going to include the types and names of hazardous waste and the hazards, estimated maximum amounts of those wastes, what hazardous waste might require unique or special treatment, a map showing where they're generated or accumulated, a map of the facility and the surroundings, a location of the water supply, identification of on-site notification systems, so that would be, you know, a PA system or an alarm or however the facility talks to and communicates with people out on the floor, and then a name of an emergency coordinator. And we did want to mention that we encourage generators to work with their emergency authorities always, but also to identify any additional information that might be needed. This list is some other clarifications and changes that we made as part of the rule. I'm not going to run through it, but it is here. I think you guys are all going to get the slides, so if you want to go and look at them, you can get an idea of some of the changes that we made. I do want to highlight the third bullet, which clarifies that the scope of the contingency planning and emergency procedures applies to areas where hazardous waste are being accumulated, generated and accumulated. So that does include the satellite accumulation areas.
Okay, so sort of related to emergency response is a new provision for a waiver. This is for what we call the 50-foot requirement. So if the generator is accumulating either ignitable or reactive waste, there's a requirement that it be at least 50 feet from the facility's property line. But we've heard over the years this can be impossible, especially in urban areas where sometimes the properties aren't that wide. So in this rule, we've added a provision where an LQG can apply to their local fire marshal or fire department to get a waiver from this requirement. And then the fire marshal will tell them what kind of precautions they need to take to make sure that they're still safely storing and accumulating either ignitable or reactive waste. We made a couple changes related to the biannual report. Again, LQGs are the ones that, large quantity generators are the ones that fill out the biannual report every 2 years. So instead of changing the regulations, whenever we change the biannual report, we are going to instead refer the generators to the form instructions because those are easier to change and keep up to date. And then we've also clarified that LQGs have to report all the hazardous waste generated and managed on site in the reporting year. And this includes even months when they were in SQG. So if they're LQG for part of the year, SQG part of the year, they report all of that hazardous waste. And then the last thing is we closed a regulatory gap related to recycling facilities that don't have a RCRA storage permit. There's limited circumstances where they can still recycle hazardous waste. Now we are requiring them to report under the biannual report system. We also clarified for tanks how you can keep records to show that if your generator is storing in tanks, that you're getting the hazardous waste off-site in either 90 or 180 days, depending on your generator category. So we clarified in the regulations how you would use records or inventory logs to show that you're transferring that waste off-site. Then closure. This is if you're closing a facility, we addressed a couple of problems here. One is that we weren't specific for LQGs that accumulated hazardous waste in containers, that they had to meet this clean closure requirement that LQGs, if you were accumulating in tanks, drip pads, and containment buildings, had to meet. And we had found there were a decent number of Superfund sites or Superfund removal actions resulting when LQGs accumulated in containers and then abandoned their facilities. So we addressed that problem, and we also addressed the problem that EPA and states weren't notified when a facility closed. So we added a notification requirement. So the final rule requires an LQG to, if they store in containers, they have to clean close. If they can't clean close, they have to close as a landfill. And then we're also requiring notification, and there's two options here. The first one is if you're just closing a waste accumulation unit or area, you have to notify either by putting a notice in the record, which we expect that's what most LQGs will do. Or if they're pretty sure they're never going to use that area again and they want to go ahead and clean close it, they can go ahead and notify EPA or the state and meet the closure performance standards. Then, if they're closing the whole facility where they've been a large quantity generator, then they have to notify using the site ID form. And this is kind of a phased approach so that states and EPA have the option if they want to go inspect. So they have to notify 30 days before they close, and then again they notify 90 days after they close that they've met the closure performance standards. Or if they can't meet them, then they notify that. They can request an extension, but they have to do it within 75 days. So there's some time for the state or EPA to go out. Okay, so that is an overview of all of the changes, at least the majority of the changes, the big changes. And this chart just gives you an idea of which apply to which category. So as you can see, the SQG, it's only those two new provisions and the reorganization. And then SQG, there's some more that apply specifically, and then the majority of the changes do apply to LQGs. This page gives you some links to our main generator website, and also the second bullet is our website that's specific to this rule. There's a link to the map that I showed you, because we do expect to see quite a few states start picking it up this year and next year, so the map will be changing. And then we do plan to add frequently asked questions and other implementation materials as are needed and as we can. So those will be added to the main generator improvement rule website. So the bottom line, this is we think a much needed update. It's a lot of changes, over at least 60 changes. Some are small, some are big, but it does affect almost every part of the generator program. And we also did some technical corrections. So it is a lot to take in, but we are here to answer questions and try to help people as best we can.
And we're almost on time.